Hi, everyone. I think we're going to start at least with my presentation while we wait for the MLA1 students, MLA2 students to come. They're walking in, some of them. So welcome to the Division of Landscape Architecture series titled Assembling Futures, which focus on the idea of future practices, especially on the role of landscape and heritage in shaping the environmental futures. We are now in the middle of the series with 3 more underway. Over the past week's lecture discussions have already raised many interesting questions, such as how do we value, manage, design, and imagine the future? How has climate change made us rethink ideas of nature and culture? And how do different projects enact different future scenarios and construct realities? Most importantly, we have also been questioning what kind of knowledge is needed to ensure that the alternative futures being created today would be better than the ones today, especially in achieving environmental and social justice. Today, we have Peter Veenstra, Peter. Peter is a Dutch landscape architect and co-founder of LOLA Landscape Architects, along with 2 others. The name LOLA is an acronym for Lost Landscapes, which was born out of a fascination for the adventurous fringe, poetic leftover space, and spontaneous nature. LOLA has undertaken different types of projects ranging from public spaces such as parks and squares to redevelopment plans, as well as large-scale projects such as the Adidas headquarter campus and the Shenzhen Bay Park. In 2013, LOLA received the Rotterdam Mascat Prize for Young Architects, and in 2014, the Topos Landscape Award. Peter is the co-author of LOLA's 2 monographs, Lost Landscapes and In Search of Sharawagi. His recent research is focused on post-disaster landscapes, carbon-positive land use, afforestation, and climate adaptation in the urban environment. Last year, he co-curated the International Architecture Biennale Rotterdam, titled It's About Time, the Architecture of Change, which looks at the past and future 50 years of climate change. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you for this introduction. Thanks for showing up today. I'm going to show 2 projects that we did, and the work that was mentioned by Natalia, the curation of the latest architectural Biennale in Rotterdam. Does this work? I think I need to enter another PowerPoint first. There. First, some images. Our office in Rotterdam works on landscape projects on various scales, ranging from, let's say, temporary garden installations, as you can see here, this indoor space, arts venue, to parks, campuses, Adidas campus in Germany, on a city scale, design for a forest ring around the city of Madrid, to, let's say, also researching and proposing strategies for water resilience on a national scale. As mentioned, the name LOLA is coming from Lost Landscapes, and this was really coming from, let's say, growing up in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a highly modernized country and rationalized country, where there's hardly any wild nature left, and all the landscapes have been, especially after the war, completely rationalized for agriculture. What you can see here is the same place, same area before and after the war, completely optimized for machine farming. Here you see the same, let's say, physically next to each other, one that has been rationalized and one more historical agricultural landscape. Now, the problem with that is that also the cities that we've developed have been inspired by the landscape, but they have been inspired by this rationalized machine landscape. So we have extremely ordered suburbs all over the country. And this is where we all grew up, and we got frustrated with this over-regulated landscape with no adventure and nothing to do. And so when we started our office, we felt like we have to find an escape, and we have to create that escape, and we have to see if we can find or create places that offer a bit more wilderness. We were inspired by nature. Nature not only as, let's say, a place of ecology, but also as a place for, let's say, unexpected encounters, a place to connect to the soil, different rhythms with history, and also a place for exploration and experimentation. Now, the first project I want to show shows a bit of that attitude, and it's a very small project in one of the emptiest parts of the Netherlands in the south. It's a former mining area where they're suffering actually from a decline in population, and as a sort of a program to attract more people, they invited a lot of designers to add points of attraction in the landscape. And we did this project. It's a castle garden formally. It's lying at the border of the country, the border of Germany. Here you can see it from a drone perspective. And there is an open field there. And if you would go there, it's just completely quiet. There's one farm, and it's bordering a piece of forest. And here you see the garden of that farm, and the farm itself is actually quite beautiful. Now, what's interesting about this place is that it has been already shown on historical maps, not just the farm, but also a couple of canals. And the suspicion was that there was a castle in the past. And so here you see, let's say, the same space on different historical maps. The shape of those canals was different through time. But archaeologists recognized this as the specific form of a fortification that was present at more spots in this region. So the idea was to, let's say, trace what was left of that history. This was done together with archaeologists. They made a reconstruct. This render is sort of professionally done based on archaeological research, and this is how it might have looked like once. The idea was, let's reveal perhaps the foundations of that castle that was once there, or the tower. And then we were invited to, let's say, make a castle garden next to it. And then let's say, together it would form a sort of point of attraction for people in the region and potentially tourists. And the interesting thing is that this area was also suffering from flooding, and it started with a very simple idea. Let's dig out again the former canals, so we create a water buffer to solve a bit of these water problems, and at the same time create this castle garden. Now, the first step in that process was to start with the archaeological research to find out exactly where those canals were. And here you see, let's say, the original plan as drawn by the archaeologists, and this is what they in the end have been digging. So they didn't really stick to the plan, and that had to do with two things. One is in case of heavy rain, those trenches would flood, and there was no possibility to dig further, so they would have to stop and start elsewhere. And the other thing is that they just, whenever they would find something interesting, they would just deviate to find out more about that. So that we thought it was actually quite an interesting process. Here you see the marking of all the objects they found in these trenches, and this is the official map of that. Where you can also see a bit of the layers, historical layers. This was, let's say, the contour of the original island on which this tower was standing. This is when we arrived to the site for the first time, and I saw this, and I was directly fascinated by it. I think it's beautiful, let's say, to see first of all these different layers of the soil. The geometry of this trench is nice, and also let's say, seeing this in this completely empty landscape where nothing is happening, it's just also fascinating and directly gives this sort of mysterious feeling. They did dig up quite some things, as you can see here, some from different centuries. Things that were thrown into the canal, into the canals, and like this part of this jug that they found. Our idea was, if we create this garden here, wouldn't it be much more interesting to make it all about archaeology and this sort of searching for this history in this absolutely empty place where nothing else is going on. And we thought, and we saw these images, the theater of the dig, let's say that it's actually quite exciting to search for this history, much more than showing sort of, in the end, fake castle garden that has never been there. So this is what we proposed, and we try to stick as close to that idea as possible. Also looking to the geometry of, let's say, archaeological research. And we thought, isn't it possible to, instead of spending everything on paving plants and trees, commission the archaeologists to do more research and to tell them where to dig more trenches and to make a composition of trenches. So that's where the project started. And this was our proposal. So here you see, let's say, on the first round of trenches, and our proposal was to. It was also a negotiation with the archaeologists, because they, of course, had also their own interests. To well, first of all, dig the water as let's say, as how the project started. Then to create this sort of hashtag on this first island. And these two were mainly for the archaeologists because they had special interest in those specific areas. And our idea was, then after the digging has been done, we mark those trenches with planting. So in the end, there is sort of trench gardens as a sort of leftover of this process. And these gardens could be a sort of a window, a time window, where people can also directly see everything that has been dug up from all these different layers of soil and these different centuries of history. The idea would be to take the findings and present them exactly on the spot where they were found. So usually you go to a museum, you see a vitrine full of pots and other leftovers. And then it's very hard to imagine how they have been used and where they have been used. And we could imagine that it's much more exciting to, let's say, see an object and realize that there was someone 400 years ago that actually was on exactly that same spot, dropping that specific object to the ground. And then, let's say, to present those objects on sticks and then on a bed of perennials and flowers. This was how we imagined that on the site. We were also expecting to find a lot of findings in the canal. So we thought it's also interesting to, let's say, present some of these findings in the canal around. In the end, with maintenance and everything, this was not possible. So we had to forget about that idea. And as a sort of extra layer, we also proposed to overlay this with a grid that usually is also used with archaeological sites, and to combine this also with a publication where also all the reconstructions of, let's say, these different periods in time are also presented on the same grid, so you could have a sort of point of reference. So this is how we overlaid it on the site. What I still forgot to tell is that there are two islands here, and let's say this was the former Tower Island in the 17th century. This was added as a decorative garden that was sort of in fashion at the time. Nowadays, let's say this area was partially the backyard of the owner of this farm over here. So with a sort of land swap, in the end, we organized it in such a way that this island became his property. The canals became public property, and then this was the bigger island was the public garden. Let's say. So this was our preliminary design, and this is how we could envision that, where yeah, this composition of trenches was sort of accompanied by sort of strips of concrete that form a sort of a path pattern, but not really. Let's say it doesn't really guide you where to go. And at the crossings of trenches, we provided a place to sit. We collaborated for this project with Piet Oudolf, and he proposed a planting scheme where basically every trench had its own color, and also had a very, let's say, tough base species that, in case of bad maintenance, would always survive. Let's say from his experience, it's very hard to, especially on the longer term, to let's say find garden people that are able to maintain his compositions. So when he arrived at this remote spot, he was directly like, okay, this is we have to make it really foolproof. So that's what's planned here. So every time there is let's say, one of these grasses, Molinia, Panicum, Sporobolus, Discussant, and Penicetum, that always give a sort of a basic volume in these different trenches. And then it happened. So this was the second dig that took place, and again, as we also already expected, but also of course really enjoyed, they only followed what we did have, leading to this pattern. They also found new interesting things like this, actually a wooden path that was from a time layer before the castle, so it was even lower in the ground. So these were these discoveries that were quite interesting. So here you see the digging. And what's interesting is that we also literally created an event around this digging. So this theater of the dig, you see it here actually taking place. So the archaeologists were the show people in this excavation, explaining what they found to the audience, and they also really enjoyed that. While usually they have a much more they're less visible with the work they are doing. And well, bigger and smaller things were found. And what we thought was interesting is to, in the final design between preliminary and definitive design, also follow, let's say, their deviations from our plan. So here you see what we originally were planning or giving them to them as a plan. And then in red lines, what they have been actually digging. And then we actually formalized that into the final pattern of this garden. So that's what you, so this is the final plan drawing, let's say, of the garden. And here we presented that, let's say, over all the historical layers in time. And then we got to an interesting process of selecting the artifacts that were found on site. Together with the archaeologists, we try to make, let's say, find a balance between things that are just look cool and things that have an interesting story. So these are some of the things that we selected to show. And they were not all historically significant like this one, but we still thought it was interesting to also present these layers of the history of this place. And then we printed basically a big map and started to put them on the location to make a final selection. And with the help of the archaeologists, let's say the stories of each of these pieces was described and put into a booklet. And they were making also, let's say, drawings like this with it to explain a bit more of what they meant and where they were coming from. Now, in the end, it was not possible to show the real objects. They had to stay in storage, but we chose to make scans and 3D prints of these objects. In the end, choosing for really cheap 3D prints, so they could also easily be replaced. If you now go to the garden, every month one is broken off and taken home by someone, and then it's just directly replaced, and it's 10 euros. So it's actually not such a problem. So this is, in the end, let's say the stick with the findings on top. Some of the, we really chose to do them one-on-one. Initially, we wanted to do them bigger just to have a bit more spatial impact, but we thought it was, for the visitor, more interesting to also see the true scale of these objects. And this is the garden as it was, let's say, directly after it was finished, still without lawn and with a temporary planting in it from above. And in the first year, still waiting for the final planting, it was covered in marigolds, which I think also was giving an interesting effect. It's monoculture. But this was more awaiting vegetation to prevent weeds to enter the soil. And then here the planting of the plant selection of Piet Oudolf is taking place, and where he was guiding, let's say, everyone, telling what to do. With here the final results from above, from an angle, and a bit more closer up. Next to this, there is an information panel. It was revealed here, where we, let's say, show from each object or mention from each object what it is and from which year it is. And it's an interesting sort of back and forth experience where people walk to an object, wonder what it is, go to the information panel, then go back. That really works, especially for kids. Let's say they really like this. Here's some photos of the, let's say, the garden with the full vegetation, and some of these objects that are almost like black flowers standing in this vegetation, just popping out of the vegetation at summer height. Now there was one practical problem, is that we gave this other island to the resident of this farm, and obviously in the end the most interesting objects were found on that island, because that was where the tower was. But we really wanted to be as direct as possible, so we didn't want to fake the location, and then that's why we chose to just make a table on which we let's say, looking at that garden where we presented all the objects that were found on the second island. So that's what you see here. Let's say left originals and right, let's say, these objects on the table. Well, here's some photos, let's say, that give the atmosphere of the final result. Let's say the planting of Piet Oudolf is also something that survives, let's say, all seasons that we have in the Netherlands, all 4 seasons. So they're specifically selected and bred the species to also have an interesting winter skeleton. Where most planting usually is cut off before the winter, here it stays there actually the whole winter and still looks interesting. Before the opening, we invited an artist to sort of respond to the work and to make a project with what she found there. And she chose to do 2 things. One is to make extracts from the plants on the site that you can see here. And she was extracting actually the colors from the different plants that were in the garden. Creating a sort of a full overview that shows not only the, let's say, the variety of plants, but also the change of seasons from, let's say, more colorful in summer to brown and beige in wintertime. A second thing she did is that part of the archaeological research was not just analyzing what was found or which artificial artifacts were found, but also what pollen and seeds were in the ground. And so we received a full report of that. And she basically ordered all the seeds of the species that were there in the Middle Ages. And she collected them and in these tubes, and they were for sale in the end. So you could basically order the sort of the medieval landscape with this, which I thought was quite interesting. We always like this, that let's say the garden is, or a project is not sort of finished when we leave the site, but it is actually the beginning of a new life, and it's also inspiring other people to also fill in or contribute to that place. And with the opening, we organized, or there was a sort of a dance performance organized, which was interesting because it led to 2 things. One is that now the local brass band is giving a concert in this garden once per year. And second is that it actually also helped to organize a garden a club of volunteers that is now maintaining this garden. So it's also really bringing people together on a place where 5 years ago, no one could have imagined that would have happened. That was the first project. Now, of course, we did much more, but what I thought was interesting to tell a bit more about is, let's say, our move to China at a certain moment. We opened up a branch office in Shenzhen. Chosha Ye is here also. She's our partner in the Shenzhen office. I would like to also show a project that we did in mainland China. And also, let's say, why we started to work there. First of all, it's let's say we got attracted by it because in the Dutch and European context, especially for the bigger projects, you have to be extremely patient. And actually most of our projects in the end were cancelled. And we also grew a frustration with that over time. And we felt that there is an opportunity here to actually build bigger projects faster, and to, let's say, once you finish a design, to also see actually the result and to be able to learn from that. And one example is this, that we started in 2018 with together with OMA on sort of development in Rotterdam for a new stadium. We were planning all the public space. 3 years later, we started to do something similar in Shenzhen, not for one stadium, but for 3 stadiums. And now we are in 2023. The Rotterdam project has been cancelled, and the Shenzhen project is under construction. So this, of course, let's say, confirms that it was for us a good idea to, let's say, combine working in the European context and also in the Asian context. And well, so it's let's say for us looking for the opportunity to work on larger scale projects and to and projects that actually get built. And on the other hand, it also leads to a lot of inspiration and what I would say productive confusion. And sort of let's say for us, it's also of course we bring our inspiration when we do projects here, but I've also learned a lot from what I've experienced here, and I try to bring it back home to the Netherlands and Europe. Now, in 2 of the last exhibitions I organized, I actually have been playing with a, let's say, Asian term. First is a exhibition that we organized called In Search of Charavaji. There it is. It's a subtitle of the exhibition, and it's let's say we selected this word because we thought it was very interesting. Because we saw some parallels with how we, let's say, the history of our office. This Charavaji started with Sir William Temple, that in the 17th century went to Asia, to China, and discovered, let's say, Chinese garden style, and was amazed by it, and it was something like he never saw before. And he described it, and he didn't remember it very well, but he came back and said, in China, they call it Charavaji. It doesn't exist, that word in Chinese, but this is how he remembered it. And so this became a term in England, actually, at the time, to describe a more of a irregularity in garden design. And he was a diplomat and a garden lover. And when he came back, he started to also introduce these ideas into the English landscape. And let's say at the time they were still producing sort of formal gardens, following the trends in France. And here you see his first attempt to introduce this irregularity. That was totally new but here is still very shy, a sort of first attempt. But he was also the advisor of the Kew Gardens, and that was the first serious project where what later became known as the English landscape style was presented. And so this garden was extremely influential and led to all the estate gardens that we know in the period that followed, and the whole landscape style that was developed. So this was all coming from someone being inspired by what he saw in China, only remembered half of what it was called, and coming back and translating it to something different. And that we found really interesting. And we were also wondering, like, what can you, let's say, if you make the travel nowadays, let's say, bring home as inspiration. One of the things we saw was interesting is in actually that term Charavaji is later also used in sound theory, and there they describe it as the sublime of everyday, which I find a fantastic description of how you could also look at landscape. It's not the great sublime, as we can see here on the left, but it's a sort of a micro dose of that experience if you have the right mindset and if you have the eye for it. And this is, let's say, a quality that I think is very interesting to aspire in projects. Second term we used in an exhibition was last year, was sort of a collective design effort. We invited 8 landscape design offices to work together on a project that we called Spongeland, or in Dutch Sponsland, which was directly stolen from sponge cities that were invented by Kong Jiang-yu. And in the end, this led to, let's say, a regional plan. So it's not focused on a city, but on a whole region, and a manifesto that we developed together on climate adaptation. 2 times, let's say, to see 2 examples to show that we also bring experience back home. Now, what we brought to China is this is the first project that's has developed furthest in construction. Project LOLA did together with LCC and Jason and a third party, Taller Architects. It's a forest park in Shenzhen. It's a 600-hectare park, part of the main ecological structure of the city in Guangming, an area that's now under development. This is how it looked when we came there for the first time. So it was really at the edge of the city, nothing much going on, with an artificial lake, a golf course, a bit of informal use of the area, and for the rest, relatively pure green. The ambition was to also strengthen the ecological connections here, to make it a strong connection in this ecological network of the city, but also as to connect, let's say, the future city to the mountains that were next to it. So it was both a sort of a nature connection and a city nature connection. It's all beautiful green, but if you look at the, let's say, the biodiversity, it was actually not that amazing. And let's say the first ambition that we introduced was to start improve the biodiversity of the forest as sort of the most important goal of this ambition to create a park here. So to go from this monoculture of trees to much richer biodiversity based much more on the local ecology. And our idea was, this is the shape of the park. This is where the city is. This is the artificial lake. To create, let's say, closest to the city is sort of a nursery of trees and plants that would, let's say, generate all the species that could be placed out into the forest and diversify it over time, and make, let's say, this growing of the trees also part of the experience of the park. To then, let's say, this is something we developed with ecologists, create a much more valuable mosaic of different biotopes on the site. In these new conditions, we would also introduce different types of uses. There was the program of sports here, and our idea was, this is a cross section of the site, going for relatively flat to rolling hills to somewhat steeper hills, to introduce a sort of a zoning where, let's say, the more easy sports and collective sports are all the way closest to the city. And the further you go in, the more it's about individual activities and more challenging sports. So 3 zones. We also proposed a whole trail network. And in this trail network, there were 2 main routes. One was already planned, a so-called greenway. They can be found all over Shenzhen and the wider region. What we propose is to add a redway to it. So let's say connection from the city to that greenway. And that's the one that you see here, sort of a main connection that would also give access to the more hilly and steep parts of the forest to people that usually wouldn't be able to get there, like old people or families with strollers. So it's also the idea for universal accessibility of wild nature. And let's say that we also saw it as a sort of a scenic route that would bring you to many different experiences and different programs. Now this Bihu loop would be the more programmed part around the artificial lake, and there we propose to have sort of a loop around the artificial lake. And a series of small stadiums devoted to innovative sports. This is also how we started. We said, if you want to make a forest park or a sports park, this is sort of national policy in China. How can you make it specific for Shenzhen? Shenzhen is all about innovation. So let's talk about innovative forestry and innovative sports. So we dived a bit into the history of sports and sort of the innovations that took place. This is just the evolution of the soccer ball, but there is also, let's say, of course, new sports are being invented all the time. And we propose to, let's say, have the sort of the base for also further exploration of new sports. So proposing sort of multi-fields, where new lines can be added over time, but each field with a different base, basically one grass, one clay, one sand, and one rubber. Allowing for different types of sports to happen there. This is a bit how we imagined it some time ago. And this is what our proposal was for the tree and plant nursery, to have this loop actually divided into a slow lane and a fast lane with a big green strip in the middle. That would be the nursery for the forest. Now this is how the master plan, we won this competition, and then this is how the master plan developed. And well, not all money was available to realize the whole project at the first time. So it started with the first phase that actually in the end converged more to actually mainly realizing this redway that we proposed. That turned in the end into a 4.5 kilometer long elevated walkway going through the site. So here, this is a small part of let's say, sort of entrance square that has been built. And there you can see this elevated walkway going all the way into the mountains. Here's some images from the entrance square where we had the most easy sports, let's say. Sort of skate area. These photos are all still without people. Huge parking area. We thought was crazy and unnecessary. We tried to convince the client to do much less. We didn't manage. Well, here's some images of the red path and how it, let's say, finds its way through the geometry is purely engineered on a 5% slope as a maximum for the accessibility. So it's, let's say, the shape is really coming from the topography of the site. Here's some exit points. At first, there was no money for the elevators, but they added them in the later. So here you see an exit point still without the elevator. And here the path and also how it, let's say, sometimes almost touches the ground, but then still leaves it open. which actually for the ecology on site is very good. There is this thing, this dilemma, I would say, right now, is that we as landscape architects, are always also promoting, of course, clean mobility, bike paths and pedestrian paths. But also these bike paths are actually ecological barriers. So in the end, for local small mammals, a situation like this is much better. And here, looking back, let's say, still without people, to the city of Guangming. And this is from the final point. It's a place that also looks good with sort of sunset, sunrise. Yeah, it's attracted in the end quite some people. This is after the opening. Still, let's say this was all when there was a lockdown in Europe. So I only could see this via images that were sent to me, but it was quite crazy. Well, here you can see, let's say, the amount of people that were going there in the first weekends. It wasn't. It was a bit more busy than we expected. This was also presented at a certain moment with a warning on the website saying, like, please don't come to the park. And also here we have been fighting endlessly about the thickness of the columns with the engineer. We wanted them to be thinner, but when we saw this, we were actually happy that we didn't win that discussion. Well, a couple of days ago was the first time actually after lockdown that I was able to visit the site, and it was amazing to see actually how many people on a regular day in the weekend were in the park and how it got used with sort of really sort of mellow play and relaxation. People making this place their own, and still quite busy, I would say, for average day. Here walking in, and what was interesting is that also is not just the this main route, but over time also new things are added. So let's say also the lower side now becomes let's say seatings are added. And also coffee places and toilets are added where people actually, yeah, you didn't see this yet, Jason. This was so, yeah, new points are added along that route where people then start to camp or to sell lemon tea. And it was just amazing to see, let's say the project is so big that it's not so much a sort of a purely controlled composition by us as a collective of designers, but it's almost also a master plan that where also things happen over time and things are added with less or more control of us. And here, what's also here, I think fantastic is that it became also a popular selfie spot and TikTok space, and so people record videos here, and I would like to show 3 of them that are, I don't know, that make me happy. It's so that's one. That one is really cool and skillful, I would say. This one, the second one, is more doubtful. I will spare you the whole video because it's quite long. And third one, oh, wait, there it goes. Oh, stop. How do I get to the next slide now? Here. Oh, there. Okay, sorry. Well, then the last one is this is a promo for wedding dresses. Well, it's a bit kitsch, but it's also still interesting that it leads kinds of cultural production. Oh, there we go again. And this is also a photo from 2 days ago in the visitor center that was built. Now there is also an exhibition of nature photos that have been taken by. There was a contest for photographers to photograph the nature in the park. So that was the winners were presented here. And what you see here on the right are children's drawings. So there was also a drawing contest among children to give their reflection on the park. So again, also here, yeah, let's say, I think it's very rewarding to see that a place like this also leads to, let's say, new inspiration for others. That was the second project. And now I will switch to something completely different, you could almost say. And this was, this is the curation of the latest architectural Biennale in Rotterdam. I was asked to be one of the 4 curators for this, and it's called It's About Time. And it was a collaboration with 2 historians and 1 transition scientist. And let's say my motivation to start on this was because I was wondering also in the recent years, are we doing enough as landscape architects? So we also always, let's say, talk about nature, biodiversity, about climate adaptation, but what is actually our impact? And are we really doing what we can? And so this was basically the start for this this exhibition, where we were wondering how architects can contribute in the best way to help solving the climate crisis that we are all facing. And what we took as an entry point here was that the exhibition was exactly 50 years after the publication of Limits to Growth. This was a research commissioned by the Club of Rome, a club of industrials and politicians concerned with the environment and let's say the footprint of humanity and the impact of humanity on the planet. And they commissioned MIT, a group of researchers, to do a research on, or make a sort of exploration or of how human society could develop over time and what trouble we might run into over time. And what they did, it was very early age of computer technology. They built as the first a world model, as they called it, where they tried to model different parameters of the system, the human system, and they looked at the population growth, resource depletion of extraction, pollution, industrial output, and food production. And they connected these different models to with each other to create, let's say, one complex model to be able to predict its behavior over time. And with that model, they developed 12 scenarios where they were, let's say, following these different parameters over time, going from 1900 to 2100, let's say, to see what would happen. In all these 12 scenarios that they developed, they could see at a certain moment a moment where, let's say, the demand for resources is bigger than what the planet has to offer. And in the different models, this would happen sooner or later. And they found, let's say, for the first, that there is a fundamental problem with a society that's focused on growth and on exponential growth, a bit better every year, annual profit, that, let's say, that leads in the end to a hockey stick curve that hits the ceiling. And even though here it looks a bit like a sort of peaceful up and down of these parameters, you can imagine that if you take the population line, that let's say this decline in population goes with a lot of stress and wars and unrest, civil unrest. Now, so this was a big warning. They published this book, Limits to Growth, in many different languages. And what's even more shocking is that in the year, when was it, 2014, the Melbourne University actually started to trace what how these parameters really behaved over time up to 2014. And what they found is that the actual curve was following the worst case scenario of the Club of Rome. And this was the scenario where people would just not act and not, let's say, change their behavior and just go on the way they were going in 1970 when they started to do this research. It fits a bit to this graph. So what you see here is, let's say, the development of concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, the publication of limits to growth over here, and then all the summits that have been organized over time to stop climate change. And it shows a bit our incapability of changing the curve of what's happening. And this is pretty alarming, obviously. And I put this image here. This is in China. We are a bit like these people here. This is the Great Green Belt, as envisioned to stop desertification in China. As you can see, is not yet so great and not yet so green. And these people are just sweeping away the sand, obviously not stopping the real issue here. Can we do more? And our question was also, can we find different attitudes that architects can take to have a bigger impact? We had selected this location for it, fantastic former gasometer. We thought it was great to have this sort of ruin of the fossil economy to organize this exhibition, also as a sort of a temple to gather projects from all over the world. Here you see the exhibition design with sort of a very intuitive routing through this space. That was really sort of one big dome where we collected all the material. In this exhibition, very central element was a timeline of climate awareness, where we traced back, let's say, the first moment of awareness and how this developed over time, how politics responded to it, also popular culture and architecture. I will go through it very quickly. Don't know how I am with time. How much? Give me some minutes. 5 minutes? 10? 10. Jason says 10. Okay? Okay, well. Then I'll go very quickly to the timeline, but it's basically, it started already a bit earlier. You could say in also the hippie times, of ecological awareness. Very important was publication of Silent Spring by Richard Carson. And you can see also in this period sort of experimentation coming up to find new ways of living. Organization of the first Earth Day that's still being, the Earth Day is still being held. Greenpeace as an activist organization, the first in 71. Conferences, first conference about climate change, organized in 72. the oil crisis, helping also to see the vulnerability of the systems that we created. Political action taken, hopeful moments like here, Jimmy Carter installing solar panels on the White House, but also criticism, skepticism, and denial. Reagan deinstalling the same solar panels 3 years later, and also failed summits over and over again. But over time, also a lot of research being done and experimentation being done. All these first experiments failed, like what you can see here, the Masdar City project from Foster and Partners that was supposed to be carbon neutral, energy neutral. This is what was built in the end. But then, hopeful, the Paris agreements. We dived into all these short-term crises, COVID, but also, let's say, the problem of climate change, slowly turning from a long-term problem into a short-term problem with also the floodings and droughts and fires that we could see over time happening. We feel very much that we live now in a sort of transition momentum where, let's say, the three things we need for real change are actually there. So there is the awareness of the problem, there is a sense of urgency, and over time we also built up, let's say, the knowledge and the tools to actually do something about it. So there is also the opportunity. Now, how can architects deal with this, and how can you as an architect or as a professional deal with it? We felt that this was very much related to also the time pressure that we face, not only in our daily lives with, let's say, the age of acceleration that we live in, but also with, let's say, these graphs that we've seen earlier, and also the way climate change is usually communicated. So it's always about being almost too late, but if we act now, we might just be on time. And this, of course, just adds more pressure. And the question is, how can you still be productive in this condition? And where, let's say, limits to growth was basically urging to limit this growth, to slow down this acceleration. We were trying to find ways to actually accelerate the transition towards a sustainable society and economy. And we found three attitudes, that of the activist, the ancestor, and the accelerator. And for all three, we gathered projects from all over the world. And I will rush through them to finish in 5. The first one is the activist. I think us as designers are definitely not activistic enough. And let's say the activist tries to, in the here and now, have an effect and tries to have an impact by, let's say, intervening either spatially or with in media and try to influence other people. We invited the activistic office from Paris to create this installation where they gathered good news and bad news concerning climate change, and they turned them into paintings or posters with the bad news on the outside. This was linked to a sort of a legend. Each of them was on the outside was linked to a news fact, and on the inside it was linked to hopeful initiatives that, if all those initiatives would scale up, would be really might be the solution for the trouble we face. But they said, in the end, you have to embrace both forces. On the one hand, the despair, you should never look away from this. And on the other hand, you have to always find also the energy to do something about it. We also invited Extinction Rebellion to actually teach architects to be a good activist. And they also take, I think, have many of their techniques are also showing parallels with what, let's say, the protests in Hong Kong were showing. And it was very interesting sessions we had with them. And we asked Extinction Rebellion to what they would need an architect for. So in the end, we decided here to take a first step into create an archive for them, so the X archive. And so there was the very first moment, is a very decentralized organization where they gathered all their products from over time to store it somewhere, to build up this record. Another thing is what we gathered was a documentation of a place in Germany where a group of protesters is living in a forest next to a large coal mine to stop further expansion of this coal mine. Nowadays, these types of activists in Europe are more and more successful, and they actually have they manage to stop let's say, unsustainable developments in Germany, but especially also in France. So also as a designer, sometimes you can also help to make a development not happen if you are convinced that it's not sustainable. Also, it comes with a very particular type of architecture. We were also always interested in the, let's say, the form that this attitude is coming with. The activistic attitude is also about offering low-cost solutions and do-it-yourself solutions. So this was a project by MIT. They developed a sort of do-it-yourself kit for residents in Eastern Europe, former Soviet states, to isolate their homes and to let's say, lower the footprint of these places. And another example was, again, a sort of very affordable do-it-yourself way to clean water in the favelas in Brazil by UZ. And a last thing about the activists is that what we found very interesting is that we found activists from 25 years ago that started very niche, small scale, and that over the stretch of 25 years, really managed to reach the mainstream. And this was an example of Super Use Studios that started with super quirky small projects and are now main advisor of the government, learning from their 25 years of trying out circular architecture, advising for, let's say, new regulation concerning circular architecture. That is also very hopeful. Second attitude is that of the ancestor, whereas the activist lives in the here and now. The ancestor sort of takes a step back and looks at the back in time and forward in time, and chooses for a more radical change in direction, not hoping to realize it tomorrow, but to take a small first step, let's say. And this is a very fundamental approach that's being very popular right now, you could say. So this is about local material, local labor, also finding new forms of architecture that allow for a changing lifestyle. In this case, a house that of which not all rooms are climatized, and some parts of the house actually require to keep your jacket on. And what we found is that actually this attitude of the ancestor, thinking about future generations, is being successful not only on the small scale, but also on the big scale. And sort of this radical change in how we live and how we relate to nature can be found also in the city of Antwerp, where they have decided to put the full ring road of highways underground to create a whole new ring park on top, which is fascinating. And I think this could only happen now because, let's say, the time is ready for it. And the last project that we showed here was even bigger, a proposal from UPenn, Richard Weller, leading the landscape department there. And it's a proposal for a world park, actually, let's say, a park stretching the globe with ecological corridors that go all the way from Tasmania to tip of Spain. This is one of the 3 corridors that has been proposed, and they connect all the most precious ecological areas on the planet, where let's say the most rare species are living. And the idea is that they also allow, with the climate zones slowly moving, for species to migrate. And it's a very, let's say, megalomaniac project, you could say. At the same time, is mostly a proposal for collaboration on an international scale when it comes to conservation, something that's happening not enough right now. And with this proposal, they managed to get a funding from the UN to further develop this project over time. So even on a global scale, let's say, designers can engage with the problems we face in a successful way. Last, I'll go through this even faster. This is the accelerator. A third let's say, approach one could take is the accelerator that is, let's say, the more tech approach of designers that sort of don't resist the system as it is, but try to work from within with the tools we have and with innovation to basically slowly bend the system towards a more sustainable future. And the idea here would be to, let's say, find solutions quicker than the problems occur, and to accelerate, let's say, the innovation in sustainability. The market is producing more and more solutions. This is a small research done by MLA Plus. They have an office in Shenzhen, but also in Rotterdam, where they made an overview of patents being registered for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And they found, of course, a sort of a very steep curve of the amount of patents being registered. Can be seen as hopeful, can be also questions, because this is the market. Patents are owned by someone, and so it's not very democratic, let's say, this type of solution. A very super inspiring example is the book. We published this book, or released this book, during the Biennale, Building with a Positive Footprint. This is a Dutch office that took, let's say, 7 flows: energy, ecology, air, waste, and 3 more. And basically took a very fundamental approach and said, we are going to leave all these 7 flows better than we found them on site. And sort of very can-do mentality, where they start also really with a 0 measuring, and also let's say, analyze the situation after the project has been finished. Because they did it successfully once, now they get a lot of, let's say, requests from other companies, mostly green companies that want to also have a proven green building, let's say. And their point is, carbon neutral is not enough. We're still producing so much carbon that we have to start thinking of carbon positive and nature positive buildings. In the end, let's say, looking for these innovations is also looking for what could be the next game changer. And we asked 2050 Plus to do a research into this and leave this very open. They came up with the development of synthetic meat, so meat produced in a laboratory. And what they found is that 60% of all agricultural fields worldwide is used for meat production, and that we are very close to be able to produce meat artificially for a comparable price to what it costs to get it from a living cow. And if this takes off, it might open up 60% of all agricultural land worldwide, and obviously this would be great news for nature conservation and other things we are planning to develop. It's not only about technological innovation. What's also interesting is that there is also an aesthetic innovation coming with this. So whereas, let's say the first generation of solar panels comes in black, just like the first Ford, now you see that there is a sort of, and now the solar panels are affordable. The Dutch government is now investing in solar panels along all highways in the Netherlands that come in different colors in that match much better with with the landscape. So there is also, let's say, this sort of technological approach doesn't need to be ugly in the end. Now, these are three approaches. The question is where you are, where we are, and what fits to your personality and your practice. And we found that in the end, of course, also the combination of all three perhaps is most interesting. And then I end with a landscape project that probably you all know. This is the work from Kong Zhangyu that developed the idea of sponge cities. And that took, let's say, combined these different attitudes. So on the one hand, starting the office, innovating on how to create sponge parks to, let's say, start realizing the concept of sponge city where, let's say, rain is absorbed and kept in the city, cleaned and then released back into the natural system as a way to organize not only the water, but also nature and a good balance between nature and city. He did that through education by communicating the philosophy behind it with his students, but also by writing letters to the mayors of the different cities in China and the leaders in Beijing. And after a disaster happening, big flood in 2014, actually they adopted his idea as a national policy. And what I find great is that every project we do in China now, we have to submit at a certain moment a 100-page document, the Sponge City chapter, where we prove that we are actually, let's say, helping to create a sustainable water system in this city. So single-handedly, he, let's say, changed the way cities are developing in China, and at the same time also just creating spaces of beauty. And that for me is really inspiring. Again, inspiration coming from Asia to us in Europe, but also as a hopeful signal for you all. And that's how I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we sitting?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for your very exciting and relevant lecture. So I want to quickly introduce two discussants to the conversation. So Susanne Trumpf is a senior lecturer in the Division of Landscape Architecture at HKU. She's the co-founder of TAL, a regionally focused library and database of landscape materials, and her research focuses on material literacy and design practices within the landscape architecture discipline. And then Jason Hilgefort is an urbanist and landscape architect. He's the founder of he founded Land Civilization Compositions in Rotterdam and is now based in Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And he has been part of the Hong Kong University Faculty of Architecture for the past 5 years as an adjunct professor. Thank you. Maybe.
First of all, thank you, Peter, for a very inspiring lecture. Very much enjoyed listening to your project. I would maybe start asking you, connecting a little bit the end and the beginning of the lecture. I thought at the beginning, for me, having lived in the Netherlands for a while, I could very much relate to this idea where you talked about the places to escape these overregulated landscapes. So, and then you ended up with this like curation of the Biennale you did, where you talked about the AAA and these different approaches. How can we suggest, or how can we propose a landscape architectural approach that leads into the future? How do you see the idea of regulating landscape within this approach?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's good and bad at the same time. I would say. So I do think that part of the change will have to come from regulation. And let's say in the exhibition, we also really looked into let's say how transitions take place. When it comes to economical transitions or in energy transition. It's also about somehow stopping old habits and phasing out old practices. And this is usually has to be forced. It doesn't usually happen by itself because let's say that most people are interested in keeping things that they are. Because it's most comfortable and it's most profitable. So I think a lot of change will have to be forced by law and by regulation. So yeah, I think it's very important. At the same time, I think also we live in a time that we, of course, have to help solving climate change, but should not forget that in the end we should also still create places that inspire people. And let's say in the end, no one wants to live in the solution of a problem. So this is not attractive, and therefore I think Prince was saying, make the rules and break them all because you are the best. I think this is sort of the attitude that you could also take as a
I mean, on that as a role as a designer, I thought it was interesting. Let's say how you talked about how maybe I'm speculating that you're evolving how you think of yourself as your role as a landscape architect. You even talked about the idea of frame. First project you presented. On the second project, you talked about the landscape as kind of a master plan. And lastly, you're a curator. And so you kind of hinted at it a bit here with the work and what you wrapped up with, speaking about folks things going on here in China. But I think you as a landscape architect is going to maybe something small scale with your initial projects. Now, when you think about how you're going forward in your role and how you've evolved, how do you think about that as the way you practice and the way you operate as maybe more of an orchestrator, or how do you see yourself as practicing landscape architecture?
I very much enjoy doing, let's say, both, and keep on also doing small scale projects and really controlling everything, and at the same time, indeed also having this sort of more coordinating a role or a collaborative approach. And yeah, they both give something very valuable. Times have changed, so of course I developed as a practitioner, but also times have changed, and let's say what made me a bit restless at a certain moment is that even though we're always, let's say from the beginning we were concerned with diversity and really focused on nature inclusivity in these things, and but in the end it's still part of the same polluting system, you know, and we're just the sort of the green calls show in between the developers game show, you know, that it's is still part of that system that is very much the part of the problem, right? So I also really feel that we have to invent different ways of working. If you run an office, of course, you cannot run an office on being a full activist and so we also have to face that reality. And I think if everyone would spend 10% of their time on taking this more fundamental approach, which is 4 hours per week, that would already help a lot. And I think this is something everyone could do while, let's say, working on business as usual projects also. Then I think that would be a great step. I asked also everyone that was involved in the Biennale, like, hey, nice project, but what are you doing next to this? And of course, in many cases, you can also see that for many of these people, a large part of what they're doing is still business as usual. That's part of the system as we know. But I think it always starts with just, let's say, taking a small first step, not necessarily being completely coherent in your practice and what you say, but allowing yourself to be also incoherent.
In a way, you answered sort of the next question that I had to you. But maybe we can elaborate a little bit on that because I was really trying to discuss a bit with you how radical can you be in your practice? I mean, you show a lot of like real projects you did. You work in all sorts of scales. How much of that idea of being radical and how much of the reality of pushing for that can you actually allow different kinds of projects, and how do you decide on that within your practice? I think that would be also a question that might be interesting to our students. We all have this idea, right? So we would like to push more, and we all know the reality, right? There is someone else who controls the budget. There is someone else who makes the final decisions, as you say, right? We had a good formulation of it to be the boss, right? The green boss. So how much do you push, or how do you curate this push in your day-to-day practice?
Yeah. Well, we're all in the end. I think the career is also just a sort of a long search for the right client, and finding the clients that fit to what you want to do. And I think it's important to not forget about that. And it's true that in most projects you cannot do what you actually wanted, or you. And I mean, our most disastrous projects were our first projects because we were, let's say, full of energy to fight and to and let's say too optimistic about our chances to win that fight. So we slowly learned there that in the end you have to also accept your defeats in those processes, and yeah, see where you can make the what you can still make out of every project in every given condition. But then every now and then, yeah, you get the opportunity to given the freedom to do it.
Since the theme of the lecture series is, and you nicely complied to this idea of heritage features. When I lived in the Netherlands, I always, because I worked there and I would work in other parts of Europe, I would always have to explain. I would jokingly say Dutch people don't care about history. Because I think your culture has a strong sense of history, but the kind of notion that, like in a sightline sort of way, like, hey, there used to be a path here. A lot of Dutch people, we don't care about the path should be there. In most other European cultures, certainly the serious ones, might have a different feeling on that. And I think in some ways, here in East Asia, there's a similar reality. There's an incredible respect for the past in reality, but it's still racing forward simultaneously towards these futures. And I wonder for you practicing here in China as well as lots of places, but also coming from your Dutch heritage or your perspective. But I wonder if you could reflect on that sort of heritage looking backwards and then future idea, how you.
Yeah, I mean, the Netherlands is super flat, and so somehow every inch of the country can be taken into, it has been taken into culture and has been altered. And of course, a large part of the country wasn't even a country before, we just created it. So there is indeed very much a mindset of looking towards the future and perhaps creating the heritage of the future rather than being concerned with the heritage. There is, but of course, this is also changing over time. One of the things I think is that we, I think, quite early were concerned with modern heritage and young heritage. I think this is also interesting as a way to look also to neighborhoods from the 60s, or even now we are doing similar researches for neighborhoods from the 80s, which is very crazy, but also interesting. It's always good to look at with respect to and I mean, I think here it's much more obvious what could be preserved. So somehow the forested mountains are clearly there and partially also just too steep to build a city in top of it. So I think there, let's say this division between what is nature and what is city is maybe more of a given, and well, I guess here in Hong Kong, thanks to also the sort of English history preserved well. But yeah, I think here this let's say this duality between nature and city is a bit clearer, whereas in the Netherlands it's more interlinked.
Okay, maybe we have time for 2 more questions. 2 more questions from the audience.
Yeah. No, let's say these 3 attitudes. I think you have to pick your attitude and go for it. I'm really convinced that if you start your practice now, there is no point in starting it the way we started it. I think it's really important if you are able now to define a practice, a start a practice that's able to generate truly sustainable projects. I think you will have the future, and otherwise you'll be phased out soon. I think it's really that would be the way to go. And of course, this is and don't be afraid to start in a niche and let's say grow in 25 years to become, let's say, the new leader or the new mainstream. I think this is well, 2 advices I think.
So to compare the modern activity, and that's Hong Kong. What do you think about that? Is there any space that to practice what we believe, like in Hong Kong, this kind of body safety.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the end, as I said, I think that somehow in all my trips to Hong Kong, I never managed to go to the nature areas. So I mainly experienced the city, and right now, as I said, in Europe, nature and city is much more interlinked, and sort of nature inclusive developments are now the standard. And in other countries, like in Singapore or in Seoul, so these also became the new standard, let's say. And I have the feeling that here it's pretty. I mean, most towers I see are straightforward, just steel and glass and mechanism. So I think the to go towards a sort of a more remain high rise and more nature inclusive high rise. I think this is it would be a great gain for Lincoln.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So thank you for the lecture. It was really, rich lecture. I'm a year one architecture student, and I really appreciate how I really like this aspect of landscape and as well as just studying them. But my question is, so you talked a lot about the first implemented design and how you would get the inspirations from. But often when you start talking about climate change, it's also important to talk about the end part. So how is it actually contributing back? So is it actually working or not? So what are some moments that you're realizing whether or not this project is working out very well?
That's a good point. I think now, because that's actually yeah, also the reason what I said earlier why I got restless at a certain moment. It was only a couple of years ago. I really was, I think I chopped down more trees than I planted with the project I did. So if I yeah would make sort of a calculation, it wouldn't be that positive. So you always see the same development with projects. You start with the great ambitions, and over time things get optimized, and the most idealistic parts don't get realized because in the end people are not so interested in it and don't want to spend the money on it. And there's, let's say, where you face this reality where your client is not as idealistic as you. Well, I think, let's say that first project there, we did realize this extra water buffer, and let's say that did help for the climate adaptation of that area. I would say in a social sense, it's in any way the end result is very positive. Maybe one more observation that I have. How to move towards a sustainable society, I think it should become much more about sharing things and, let's say, private austerity and public wealth. So having a public space that is very generous and makes you want to be there and spend time. I think this is the best way to promote also a lifestyle with less possessions and maybe less daily consumption. And so I do believe that public space projects in general contribute to it, and also contribute to, let's say, people meeting each other and creating a more healthy society. Now the second project, the Forest Park project, there is a good example that in the end, only part of this forest improvement has happened. And at the same time, of course, also the sort of the colonization of the forest much more than originally expected happened. So and then now you see that also the response, of course, is to add more and more of these places in the forest. Let's say the footprint of this project big of back, bigger than coming in.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm going to end this lecture. Thank you, Peter, so much for having us. Thank you for having the lecture. And Susie and Jason, thank you for your questions. Just one thing I wanted to bring up is that we still have 2 more lectures in our series. So the next one will be March 29th. And just as an important reminder, this lecture will be in the JC Cuban Tycoon. So there'll be a registration that is going to be open starting tomorrow. And it's for Richard Engelhardt. And so who's a visiting professor here. So hopefully all of you will also join this lecture. Okay, thank you.